Welcome back for the second part of Chapter 43, covering the infamous sinking of the RMS Titanic on the 15th of April. If you haven't yet listened to Part 1, I highly suggest you go back and listen to that now before proceeding with this episode. In Part 1, I covered everything from the dreams of Bruce Ismay of the White Star Line and architect Thomas Andrews to the laying of the keel, Titanic's departure from Southampton, right up till the moment it slipped beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Part 2, this week's chapter, picks up right from where we left off last week. I'll tell you of the crew and the aftermath of the sinking, the inquisitions, the recoveries, stories of the passengers and crew, both whom survived and perished, including the now famous passenger bearing the name J. Dawson. Finally, we'll examine who might be to blame for the whole ordeal and the destiny of the Titanic. You're listening to the Insidious Agenda podcast, and as always, I'm your host, Nick. Without further delay, let's jump from the ship's side as she goes down and re-enter the frigid cold waters of the North Atlantic. Every possible emotion of human fear, despair, agony, fierce resentment, and blind anger mingled. I am certain of those, with notes of infinite surprise as though each one were saying, "How is it possible that this awful thing is happening to me, that I should be caught in this death trap?" These were the words of survivor Lawrence Beasley, who watched the aftermath of the Titanic sinking from lifeboat number 13. Those who have seen Cameron's film may recall the scene where sailors are frantically trying to cut the rope of one lifeboat before another came down on top of it. Lifeboat 13 was the one underneath, luckily freed in time by boiler room number 6 stoker Fred Barrett. "It came as a thunderbolt," Beasley continued. "Unexpected, inconceivable, incredible. No one in any of the boats standing off a few hundred yards away can have escaped the paralyzing shock of knowing that so short distance away, a tragedy, unbelievable in its magnitude, was being enacted, which we, helpless, could in no way avert or diminish. 1,500 people went into the sea on the bitterly cold morning of April 15th, 1912. At near 2:30 a.m., the water temperature was a bone-chilling -2 degrees Celsius. Those in the Atlantic tried everything they could to stay afloat and get out of the water. They clung to wooden beams, doors, furniture, paneling, and pieces of the bulkhead. There was no shortage of danger from the debris being kicked out of Titanic. Often, our mind thinks these things just floated out of the ship on its way beneath the waves. But most often, as Titanic descended into the depths, these items were sent rocketing upward to the surface and caused serious injuries and might have even killed some of those on the surface. As the human body is rapidly submerged in cold water, it enters a state of cold-induced shock. From this are born lethal repercussions. Most common among those are cardiac arrest, uncontrollable breathing, and severe hypothermia. The feeling of 1,000 knives being driven into the body at once, as was described by Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who was among the unfortunate many that didn't have a seat on a lifeboat. It was a painful an agonizing way to die in the 15 to 30 minutes it took those in the water to suffer death from cardiac arrest. The nearest boat to many swimmers was collapsible boat B. 12 members of the crew got aboard, with another 35 clinging to the sides. They couldn't risk the boat capsizing or being overwhelmed, so they were forced to paddle away, forced to ignore those trying to get aboard. One of the men on board was Colonel Archibald Gracie, who had one of the more interesting stories from this point in time. In no instance, am I happy to say, did I hear the word of any rebuke from a swimmer because of a refusal to grant assistance. One refusal was met with the manly voice of a powerful man. "All right, boys. Good luck, and God bless you." I heard the men say that Captain Smith was at the boat, and Stoker Harry Sr. and Cook Isaac Maynard said that Smith was there. The presence of the captain was confirmed by fireman Walter Hurst, also aboard collapsible boat B. "All right, boys. Good luck, and God bless you." That's what he heard, same as Gracie. Hurst said it was a voice of authority that last said, "Good boys. Good lads." Overcome by the swimmer's valor, he tried to reach out to him with an oar, but the man was already dead. A short distance away, another 20 swimmers made it to collapsible boat A, which was not put together properly before it was launched, so it suffered an incursion of water, and the occupants within had to sit in a foot of water all night, with some dying of hypothermia. Another distance away, many of the lifeboats drifted together, while the passengers inside them and the empty seats pondered what came next. Lifeboat 4, one of the last to launch, was the closest and saved 7 on its way clear of the ship's side, 2 of whom succumbed to the elements. Collapsible boat D saved another one. Those already in the lifeboats decided against returning to the site, for fear their boats would be overwhelmed and would capsize. It wasn't just the passengers aboard, but the crew even objected. Quartermaster Hitchens was extremely vocal in his desire not to return, as, in his reasoning, there are only a lot of stiffs out there. So let's pause for a moment and put ourselves in the lifeboats. You've just survived arguably the greatest tragedy in your entire life. You've witnessed events that no one should ever see, and you believe might never see again. As much as you might want to return, you're not in the right headspace to make that decision, likely being so far into the black that it's unfathomable. You're tired. You're freezing cold, and death is all around you. You don't know if you'll be rescued, or if you'll die where you sit. Listening to the crying, the screaming, the yelling, and the pandemonium that's only a few hundred feet away. It starts at a deafening pitch, and gradually becomes weaker, quieter, and then silence. The last call-out was recalled by Lady Lucy Duff Gordon. The very last cry was that of a man who had been calling loudly, my God," he cried monotonously, in a dull, hopeless way. For an entire hour there had been an awful chorus of shrieks, gradually dying into a hopeless moan, until this last cry that I speak of. Then all was silent. Only 2 lifeboats went back into the fray. The more well-known was Lifeboat 14, commanded by Harold Lowe, the 5th officer, who, if he didn't know Lightoller was present, might have believed that he was the ranking officer. The other was Lifeboat 4. He waited for the sounds of dying passengers to thin out so as not to risk his lifeboat being overtaken, and then would paddle back to the site. Lowe gathered a group of 5 lifeboats together and transferred his passengers out to make room, 7 crew were hand-selected to go with him, as well as 1 male passenger who volunteered. The lifeboats paddled into a grave site. Hundreds of bodies and lifebelts scattered about the glass top of the North Atlantic. In his words, the dead seemed if they had perished with the cold, as their limbs were all cramped up. Hundreds of dead people, bobbing there like corks. The efforts of the makeshift crew of Lifeboat 14 were not in vain, however. They managed to rescue 4 people still alive and get them into the boat, unfortunately losing 1 to hypothermia shortly thereafter. Harold Lowe later stated that he and the crew heard a few more voices in the dark amongst the dead, but despite his crew's best efforts, they were unable to locate any more in the 45 minutes of his doomed rescue mission. Lowe was noted as being the only one to make use of his lifeboat's mast and sail while they were deployed. In the other lifeboats, those who survived could do nothing but sit and wait and wonder. There was no food, no potable water, and no light save for a few flashlights. Undertaking considerable risk, traveling at high speed through the night and traversing the ice field, the RMS Carpathia arrived to rescue the stranded passengers just at or before 4 a.m. Having dodged numerous icebergs en route, the lights of the Carpathia could be seen by the survivors as early as 3:30. Collapsible Boat B was nearly under water by this point, and Collapsible Boat A were faring no better. They were able to find seats in other lifeboats, and were forced to abandon the 3 deceased in the collapsible boats to their fate. Fast forwarding, about a month later, that boat was recovered by the RMS Oceanic, with all 3 cadavers still inside. As the sun rose that morning, the rescued Titanic passengers aboard Carpathia witnessed the ice field in clear view. There was ice everywhere, great, innumerable periods of ice, as detailed by the Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron. Some of the icebergs broke the water and rose up 200 feet, accompanied by smaller icebergs throughout. The landscape appeared as one big sheet of ice, scattered with the debris of Titanic and its former passengers. The crew of the Carpathia used all available means to get passengers aboard. Those who felt strong enough could climb the rope ladders. Others were hoisted in slings, and some of the children were hauled up in mail bags. The last passengers to be disembarked were those in Lifeboat 12. Among them was Charles Lightoller, who, it appeared, had finally learned how many souls the boat could carry. Lifeboat 12 disembarked 74 from a lifeboat which was meant to hold 65. On the deck of the Carpathia, passengers were met with mixed emotion. Some families were elated to be reunited, having survived the unimaginable. Others watched as boat by boat came on board, and they lost hope, realizing the worst, that their loved ones had failed to come aboard and were not among the living. The rescue operation was complete in full by 0900, with 2 other ships, the Mount Temple and the Californian, arriving minutes later. The Carpathia recharted her course to New York, as she was previously bound for Austria-Hungary. It didn't have the medical facilities nor the provisions to care for all of Titanic's passengers. The other 2 ships searched for survivors for a further 2 hours, but were unable to locate any. As Carpathia steamed towards New York, White Star Line was already busy making arrangements for the collection of the deceased. It chartered 3 ships from the eastern Canadian seaport in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Mackay Bennett, the Minia, and the Montmagny, as well as the Algerine from St. John's, Newfoundland, to conduct those operations. Together, they were successful in pulling 328 bodies from the Atlantic. 119 were buried at sea, while the remaining 209 were returned to Halifax, which, coincidentally, is the hometown of your favorite podcast host. The Carpathia arrived in New York the evening of the 18th of April, the day after the Titanic was due in. Along the way, it fought ice, fog, thunderstorms, and rough sea conditions. The public never knew what happened until the Carpathia's radio messages were heard by listeners and other ships. The following morning, the newspapers spread the story. When the Carpathia pulled in, the survivors were greeted by a crowd of 40,000 looking to see them for themselves. Memorials to the victims were raised in New York, Washington, Southampton, Liverpool, and Belfast, with too many others to name. Commemoration ceremonies were held in England, the United States, and Canada for those who passed, and efforts were made to raise money for the families of the deceased. In all honesty, most of the deceased were never located, and the only thing that remains of them are the sets of shoes that line the ocean floor of the Atlantic off the Grand Banks. White Star Line was so overwhelmed with outrage that they were forced to release a list of the deceased from the balcony of their headquarters, reading the names one by one. Two sentiments began to grow during the fallout of the event. The public was outraged and began asking why there were so few lifeboats, pointing the finger at Bruce Ismay, who was, without a doubt, suffering a great amount of survivor's guilt. The survivors began turning their efforts towards future safeguards for ocean travel. Outside of the public, those who were tied to the Titanic in some way were the hardest hit. Possibly the sentiment echoed no more than in the Irish city of Belfast, who had been responsible for the ship's construction. The Olympic line was a symbolic achievement for Northern Irish shipbuilding and was dashed within a few hours. The Irish in Belfast packed into churches to attend services and wept in the city's streets. They felt a resounding sense of grief and felt that they were responsible for what happened. Their laments were also echoed in Southampton, which was home to 699 members of the crew and many passengers. The public inquiries that followed, in both England and the United States, came to the same conclusions. The first, being the regulations on number of lifeboats that were required, were out of date and inadequate for modern sailing. The second was the confirmation that Captain Edward Smith failed to pay proper regard to the warnings of the ice in the vicinity. Others were that the lifeboats hadn't been properly crewed nor provisioned, and that the collision was a result of going into a dangerous area at too high of a speed. There was no indication that any form of negligence on the part of White Star Line existed. The final result was the inquiries chalking this up to an act of God and absolving Captain Smith of any wrongdoing, stating that the procedures he followed were long-standing and were not previously shown to be unsafe and were exactly what other skilled men would have done in his position. After all, 3.5 million passengers had been carried by British ships in the past decade, and only 73 lives were lost. The case of Titanic did set a precedent, however, such that, where Titanic's sinking and the associated factors that led to it were a mistake, in the future, a repeat of any of these items would be viewed as negligent. Nonetheless, the event brought many changes to maritime regulations, such as ensuring that more lifeboats were present aboard than would be required. Lifeboat drills had to be carried out properly and at regular intervals. Radio operators were required to be present around the clock and had to give priority to emergency and hazard messages over passenger communications. Shore stations were required to handle all the calls regardless of network. For example, Marconi in Britain and Telefunken in Germany. They also established an international ice patrol to monitor and report on icebergs in the North Atlantic. All of these new regulations and many others were established in the document called SOLAS, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. Now, before I segue into the passenger and crew profiles, let me fill you in on the final numbers of those living and dead. And prepare yourselves, because it's quite shocking. Overall, 32% of the souls on board Titanic were saved, numbering 710, while the other 1,514 died. For men, only 338, or 20%, survived, while 1,352 perished. The deceased were made up of 118 first class, or 67%, 154 second class, 92%, and 387 third class, 84%, with 693 crew, or 78%. For women, 316, or 74%, survived, while only 109 perished. The deceased were made up of 4, or 3% of first class, 13, or 14% of second class, 89, 54% of third class, and 3, or 13% of the crew. For children, 56, or 51% survived, while 53 perished. The deceased were made up of 1, or 17% of first class, with no losses from second class, and 52, or 66% of third class. Unbelievable numbers. 80% of all men embarked on Titanic perished, in comparison to 26% of women. The two numbers that stand out to me the most are 97% of all first-class women survived, in contrast to the 92% of second-class men that died. Part of me can't help but wonder if this event took place in the modern day, 2023, if the numbers would look vastly different, given the modern equality that we now have in place, or if we would revert to our traditional gender roles in a survival situation. Hopefully, we never have to find out. So before I get into the legacy that Titanic has left behind, let's look at the few profiles of those who were embarked on Titanic and find out ultimately what happened to them. To accomplish this, I've tried to find stories of men, women, and children, in addition to a member of the crew and an officer. So let's begin with our first-class male subject, none other than John Jacob Astor IV. He was born on the 13th of July in 1864 at his parents' estate in Rhinebeck, New York. His father, William, was a businessman and collector who had a penchant for breeding racehorses. His mother, Carolyn, was what we call a socialite and loved to entertain. He was the youngest of 5 and the only brother to 4 sisters, Emily, Helen, Charlotte, and Carrie. The Astor family was one of the wealthiest in the United States, having found its footing through John Jacob Astor I in the fur trading business. The Astor family also had connections through marriage to the likes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Grace Vanderbilt. He went on to attend university at Harvard. In 1894, he wrote the science fiction novel A Journey to Other Worlds, which speaks about human life on Saturn and Jupiter and is set in the year 2000. He patented inventions of the bicycle brake and turbine engines. In the mid-1890s, he served as a colonel in the U.S. military during the Spanish-American War. During the conflict, his family funded an artillery unit known as the Astor Battery and was made up of volunteers. His service was complete in 1898. Following his discharge, he was sometimes affectionately referred to as Colonel Astor. He married his first wife, socialite Ava Lowell Willing, on the 17th of February in 1891. They had 2 children, William and Ava. The couple divorced near 2 decades later, in 1909, in an affair marred by scandal. A short time later, the now 47-year-old J.J. Astor married his new wife, Madeline Force, who was only 18. This was not a popular marriage amongst some, due to the age disparity, especially within the American public and the upper-class socialites. The one person who didn't have an issue with this, however, was Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She accompanied the couple on their honeymoon to Europe and Egypt, and at their invitation, went with them aboard the Titanic. Aboard the ship with JJ, Madeline, and Molly was the couple's dog, an Airedale named Kitty. After the collision, the captain advised JJ to wake his wife, as they might have to take the boats. Astor did so, telling her that there was a collision, but that it didn't appear to be anything serious. They donned their life belts and headed up to the boat deck. They spent some time playing with some gym equipment and examining one of the life belts that JJ had cut open to show his wife. When lifeboat number 4 was being loaded, Astor put his wife on board, along with her maid and nurse. He attempted to plead with Charles Lightoller for a seat due to his wife's delicate condition. She was pregnant, but he was denied. He was told the number of the boat by Lightoller so he could find her later. Astor helped the lifeboat's final 2 passengers aboard and then watched as it was lowered away. As the other passengers and crew worked to free the lifeboats and set them up, Astor was remembered standing off by himself. He was last seen smoking a cigarette with passenger Jacques Futrelle. John Jacob Astor's body was recovered by the McKay Bennett on the 22nd of April and was only identified by the initials stitched into his jacket. His body was found to have sustained severe crush damage, leading to the belief that he was likely crushed under the funnel that collapsed. He was buried in the cemetery of Trinity Church in Manhattan. 4 months after his death, his wife gave birth to their son of the same name, 6th in the line. He was portrayed in James Cameron's Titanic by Eric Braeden, and his most prominent scene was at the dinner in the first-class dining saloon. Our second-class passenger profile is that of Eva Miriam Hart, who was only 7 when she boarded the Titanic. Eva was born on the 31st of January in 1905 in the county of Essex in England. She was raised in a mixed religious household. Her father, Benjamin, was Jewish, while her mother, Esther, was a Christian. As an only child, Eva attended St. Mary's Convent in London. In the earlier months of 1912, her father decided the family would emigrate to Canada and reside in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where they would join his brother, and they were forced to move because of economic recessions in England. The family boarded the Titanic on the 10th of April to start their journey. Originally, they were supposed to travel on the SS Philadelphia, but a coal shortage kept the ship from carrying out its crossing, so the Hart family, like many others, were transferred to Titanic. The night before they boarded, Eva's mother was very wary that some catastrophe was about to happen. Mainly, it was spurred on by a ship calling itself unsinkable in the face of God. Thus, even after they embarked, Esther slept only during the day and remained awake in their cabin, fully dressed, at night. After the collision, when Benjamin confirmed what was happening, he woke Eva up and wrapped her in a blanket. The family headed for the boat deck, and Benjamin found a place for his wife and daughter on lifeboat 14. Benjamin's last words to his daughter were, "Be a good girl and hold Mummy's hand." Of course, this line is now immortalized in Cameron's film. That was the last time she ever saw her father, and his body was never identified, if it was recovered at all. Eva and her mother were among those rescued by Carpathia, and eventually arrived in New York City. The pair returned to England because her mother never wanted to leave in the first place. Eva's mother died in 1928, when she was only 23. Following this, she continually suffered nightmares and recollections of the Titanic sinking. To face this, Eva Hart booked herself a ticket on a passenger ship bound for Singapore. She locked herself in her cabin for 4 days until the nightmares went away. "I saw that ship sink," she later said. "I never closed my eyes. I didn't sleep at all. I saw it, I heard it, and nobody could possibly forget it. I can remember the colors, the sounds, everything. The worst thing I can remember are the screams. It seemed as if once everybody had gone, drowned, finished, the whole world was standing still. There was nothing, just this deathly, terrible silence in the dark of the night with the stars overhead. Eva Hart also recalled the band playing Nearer My God to Thee in its final moments. Eva went on to become a professional singer in Australia, an organizer for the Conservative Party, and a magistrate. During the Second World War, she volunteered as an organizer of entertainment and emergency supplies during the Blitz. She lived in East London until her passing from cancer in 1962, just shy of her 91st birthday. Until the end, she was a frequent critic of White Star Line and the SS Californian, who was so close to Titanic that she could see the lights. But it was a ship that never came. Her wish was that Titanic be treated as the gravesite that it is, and humanity never attempt to raise it. If you want to know more about Eva's story and experiences in greater detail, please check out her autobiography titled Shadow of the Titanic, a survivor's story. From Third Class, we're going to focus on 19-year-old passenger Edward Thomas Lockyer. The son of Frederick Lockyer and Jane Masters, Edward was born on the 3rd of November in 1892 in the town of Sandhurst, Kent County, England. There were two things that the Lockyers made extremely well: watches and children. Edward had 14 brothers and sisters, and he was near right smack in the middle, the 9th oldest. Edward was unmarried, and found employment as an assistant grocer and draper who lived at 57 Lyall Mews in London. With ticket number 1222, which cost him £7 and 17 shillings, he boarded the Titanic in Southampton. His destination was Ontario, New York, where he was to meet up with an old friend, E.J. Robbins. Stories of Edward say he was very social on board and made many friends among other passengers, like Emily Bateman, Sarah Roth, and Thomas Theobald. It's unknown what happened to Edward during the sinking, but he was confirmed deceased and recovered by the ship the Mackay Bennett. Edward's body was buried at sea on the 24th of April 1912. He perished wearing a blue jacket, gray vest, black pants, and boots. On his person at the time were keys, presumably belonging to his flat, a silver watch, a medal marked FSS, glad knives, and other miscellaneous items. Unfortunately, as there were so many third-class passengers, many we don't have intricate stories of unless they survived. Which is why I've been saving until now the news about next week's episode. Because next week, we're going to hear the story of third-class passenger Leah Axe and her son, from her descendant and great-granddaughter, Dr. Shelley Binder herself. So if you're not subscribed already, now's a good time to do so you don't miss that interview. That episode will be released on Tuesday the 1st of August. Our fourth profile being covered is that of the 5th officer, Harold Godfrey Lowe. I made the decision to cover Sub-Lieutenant Lowe, not because he was the only one to have a lifeboat that went back looking for survivors, but because in Cameron's film, he's played by Welsh actor Ioan Griffith, which was an absolutely appropriate casting when you consider that Lowe was also Welsh. Griffith is the same person who also plays one of my favorite fictional childhood heroes, Horatio Hornblower. Coincidentally, Hornblower was also a young naval officer, albeit during the time of the Imperial Navy. They're still some of my favorite movies, based on the books by C.S. Forester, and if you've never seen them, definitely give them a chance. Harold Lowe was born in Llanrwst, Carnarvonshire, in Wales, on the 21st of November in 1882. He was the middle of 8 children born to George Edward Lowe and Emma Quick. Although his father only wanted him to ever be a businessman in Liverpool, Harold had dreams of going to sea. So, at the age of 14, he saw fit to run away from home and join the merchant navy. His travels took him to the west coast of Africa, where he started at the rate of ship's boy aboard schooners and worked to attain his seafaring certifications. He was successful in 1906 in gaining his second mate's certification, followed 2 years later by his first mate's. In 1911, he came under the employment of White Star Line and gained his master's certificate. Lowe had proclaimed experience with near every ship afloat, from schooners to sailing vessels and steamships of all sizes. One of his first rates was as the third officer on White Star Line's Belgic and Tropic. From here, he accepted a transfer in 1912 to the formidable Titanic as fifth officer. Harold Lowe was overborne with excitement, as the maiden voyage of Titanic was to be his first transatlantic crossing. He reported into the offices of White Star Line in Liverpool at 9 a.m. sharp on the 26th of March and was transported to Belfast, where he boarded Titanic the following day. He assisted in the sea trials, where Titanic gained her seaworthiness certification. When Titanic slipped from Southampton, Lowe was hard at work on the bridge, relaying messages to various other parts of the ship. As he had never worked with the other officers aboard, he often felt like an outsider, having never traversed the open Atlantic. At 8:00 p.m. on the 14th of April, he was relieved on the bridge by 6th Officer Moody. He returned to his quarters and slept through the collision. When he was awoken, he got dressed and reported to the bridge. During the evacuation efforts, 3rd Officer Pittman charged him with loading the lifeboats and ordered him to get into Lifeboat 14 when it was prepared to descend. Don't forget, 14 was also carrying Ava Hart. In defense of Lifeboat 14, it's believed he fired 3 shots of his revolver into the air and was reported saying, "Get back or I'll shoot you like dogs." In Cameron's film, this line was given to Charles Lightoller. Into the modern day, we still don't know who actually fired the revolver. As I've already detailed his efforts in the lifeboats, we'll continue past that. During his questioning at the New York Board of Inquiry, Lowe was known for being a bit cheeky. When asked what the iceberg was composed of by a United States senator, he replied, "Ice, I suppose, sir." Lowe, Lightoller, and the other surviving officers, Boxall and Pittman, were resentful of the American authorities for the poor treatment they received during the inquiries, especially when they found out that none of the inquisitors had any knowledge of sailing nor seafaring. When he returned home to the town of Barmouth, he was heralded with a hero's welcome. 1,300 people attended his reception. As a gift, they gave him a gold watch with an inscription that read, "Presented to Harold Godfrey Lowe, 5th Officer, RMS Titanic, by his friends in Barmouth and elsewhere, in recognition and appreciation of his gallant services at the foundering of the Titanic, 15th April, 1912. In September of 1913, Lowe married the love of his life, named Ellen Marion Whitehouse. The couple had 2 children, Florence Josephine and Harold William. Lowe continued to serve the sea in the Royal Naval Reserve during World War I. He was present in the port of Vladivostok during the Russian Revolution and attained the rank of lieutenant. Following the culmination of the war, he returned to the Merchant Marines and White Star Line as a commander until his retirement in 1931 in Daganwi. During the Second World War, Lowe offered his home up as a sector post and himself as an air raid warden until his health declined and bound him to a wheelchair. Harold Lowe died of hypertension on the 12th of May in 1944 at the age of 61. He is laid to rest at the churchyard in Llandro yn Rhos in North Wales. Now we turn our attention to another amazing story, that of crew member Violet Jessop. Violet Constance Jessop was born on the 2nd of October in 1887 in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, the oldest daughter of Irish immigrants William and Catherine. She had 9 brothers and sisters. She spent her childhood years helping her mother care for and raise her younger siblings. Violet became violently ill during her youth with what was presumed to be tuberculosis. The doctors prescribed her condition to be fatal, an illness that, against all odds, she survived. And I want you to keep that in mind as I tell you the rest of her story. She lost her father at the age of 16 from surgical complications. Her family decided then to uproot and travel to England. In England, Violet attended a religious school at a convent. She was forced to take care of her younger siblings again while her mother was away at sea working as a stewardess. After illness found her mother, Violet left school to help support the family. She signed up to be a stewardess, like her mother was. In order to be hired, Violet actually had to dress down to make herself less attractive so that they would actually hire her. Her first post as a stewardess was at age 21 with the Royal Mail Lines Orinoco in 1908. In 1911, her stewardly duties took her aboard the White Star Line's Olympic. She was on board the ship on the 20th of September 1911 when it collided with the HMS Hawke, a British warship, after leaving Southampton. She remained with Olympic, choosing never to speak of the incident until April of 1912, when she was transferred to Titanic. She boarded with the other crew and passengers on the 10th of April. During the sinking of the ship, she was ordered up to the boat deck to serve as an example to non-English-speaking passengers on how to behave and to offer instructions. Watching as the crew were loaded, she was eventually loaded onto Lifeboat 16. When the boat was being lowered, one of the Titanic's officers thrust a baby into her arms for her to take care of. She was rescued by the Carpathia and taken to New York City. The mother of the baby found Violet on board, took the child from her arms, and ran off crying without saying a word. Eventually, Violet found her way back to Southampton. She continued on as a stewardess into the First World War when she found herself working for the British Red Cross. And where, of all places, was Violet transferred to? None other than the HMS Britannic, a ship that had been converted from a luxury liner to a hospital ship. She was present on board the Britannic when, on the morning of November 21st, 1916, the ship was sunk in the Aegean Sea. That ship went down in 55 minutes, but only lost 30 of the 1,000-some people aboard. Violet and 2 other Titanic passengers, Arthur John Priest and Archie Jewell, all survived the sinking. So for Violet Jessup, that makes an accident on the Olympic, and surviving the sinking of both Titanic and Britannic. She returned to work with White Star Line in 1920 before crossing over to Red Star Line and then back to the Royal Mail Line. During her time on the Red Star Line's Belgenland, she circumnavigated the globe twice. At the age of 36, she married John James Lewis, a fellow of the White Star Line stewards. The marriage only lasted a year before the pair divorced, and in 1950 she retired back to the county of Suffolk. One of the stories Violet told, that was many years after her retirement, was on a night marred by thunderstorms. She received a call from a woman who asked her if she saved a baby on the night the Titanic sank. Violet replied that of course, yes she did. Afterward, the voice told her, "I was that baby." The mystery caller laughed and hung up. Jessup's biographer theorized that it was possibly some children in the village who teased her until she told him, "No, John, I have never told that story to anyone before I told it to you." The only baby on Lifeboat 16 the night of the sinking was a Sod Thomas, who was given to passenger Edwina Trout and then reunited with his mother on the Carpathia. Whether or not Violet's story is true, it's nothing short of amazing and incredible. The world said farewell to Violet on the 5th of May in 1971 after she passed away from congestive heart failure. It's believed that in Cameron's film, Violet Jessup's character was the source material for the character known as Lucy, a woman who was asked to wear her life jacket by Mr. Andrews in order to convince other passengers to do the same. Now, I know Molly Brown bears the title, but for me, I strip that away from her and I give it to the unsinkable Violet Jessup. And at last, we come to the story I'm sure you've all been waiting to hear. The true story of Rose DeWitt Bicator. I do have written in my script pause for effect, as yes, Rose DeWitt Bicator was only a fictional character created by James Cameron. Although I do want to mention that she was inspired by real-life artist Beatrice Wood, as the two shared similarities in their past and their love of art. Also fictional was the man who boarded with her, Caledon Hockley. For that matter, also was Jack Dawson, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. But wait a moment. I told you last week that there was actually a Jay Dawson who was a member of Titanic's crew, so he had to be real, right? Joseph Dawson was born on the 1st of September in 1888 to parents Patrick Dawson and Kate Madden. He had a younger sister named Maggie and a stepsister named Bridget. The Roman Catholic family lived together in Dublin at 49 Lower Rutland Street, one of the poorest areas of the city. The family home had only 2 rooms. He began working at a young age, making a living in carpentry and porting before joining the British military. Joe Dawson enlisted in Dublin on the 28th of July in 1908 at the age of 19. Dawson served in the military's medical corps under regimental number 1854. His enlistment form says he stood 5'7" and weighed 144 pounds. He had brown hair, gray eyes, and a fresh complexion with a small scar just above his eyebrow. He had poor medical health and was often seen for physical issues like boils and laryngitis. His mouth was also considered extremely septic, and after only a year, he had 5 teeth removed, continuing with various other dental procedures over the next 2 years. He trained at the bases of Aldershot and Netley, unmarried up to the point of him turning 21. In July of 1911, he transferred to the Army Reserve after his 3-year service contract was complete. From here, he entered the Merchant Marines and traveled to Southampton looking for any work he could find. He found a position on the Adriatic on the 24th of July and went to sea with a monthly wage of £5 10 shillings. It was his first experience, understanding that there were crew class separations like those of the passengers. He took up work as a trimmer and quickly realized that he was standing on only the bottom rung of the corporate ladder. And unfortunately for Joe, he wasn't anything more special than a third-class passenger. He later transferred to the Majestic, and when the Great Coal Strike of 1912 started, he was sent to Titanic. Here, he signed on to the Titanic as a trimmer, and I apologize if I haven't let you know what that term is yet. Trimmers were ultimately coal dispatchers, ensuring that coal was evenly distributed amongst the ship and had no list from coal stores. One piece of evidence that leads us to believe that Joseph had some level of education was that he had signed on to Titanic with his own signature, and not just a mark. When he boarded Titanic, Joseph Dawson was 23 years old. When Titanic struck the iceberg, Joseph was off duty. He woke up to the pandemonium in the decks, grabbed his coat, and headed for the boat deck. When the ship went under, he went into the water and swam away, before succumbing to hypothermia. Joe's body was recovered by the Mackay Bennett, and he was brought to Halifax. As his body went unclaimed, he was buried at Fairview Lawn Cemetery on the 8th of May in 1912. His gravesite can still be visited at the same location in Halifax today. His recovery tag, and all that's left of him, read number 227, male, estimated age 30, hair and light mustache. Clothing, dungaree coat and pants, gray shirt. No marks on body or clothing. Effects, NSNS Union 35638. Trimmer. Name, James Dawson, 17 Britain Street, Southampton. And since you're probably wondering, the answer is no. James Cameron had no idea that there was any person on Titanic that was named J. Dawson. That being said, it didn't stop many people from coming to the peninsular province from far and wide to lay flowers at the gravesite of Joseph Dawson, mistaking him for the fictional Jack. It is, however, a neat, if uncalculated touch to have had Jack playing with a piece of coal in the boiler rooms during the movie. It's also believed that Joseph was courting a young woman named Nellie Priest, who lived at the address he gave when he boarded. The sinking of the RMS Titanic is a historical event that we can always look back on, which will shock and amaze us. The whole event was a needless waste of human life, and from that great tragedy were born many naval and sailing reforms that hopefully have prevented further deaths in the century that followed the Titanic's sinking. So, on who or what do we place the blame? Well, we can look back on the failure of the captain to heed the warnings that were sent to his ship. We can point fingers at the White Star Line for cutting costs in their pursuit of the most luxurious ship the world had ever seen. We can look at the failure of the officers, who didn't know the specifications of their equipment on board, and who could have adequately prepared for the worst. Then can we also implicate the radio operators, who didn't relay all of the hazard messages, or the lookouts for not having the proper equipment, or the passengers for not showing a sense of urgency and heeding the orders of the crew? There's no other way to put it than the fact that Titanic was really a comedy of errors, and I mean that in all seriousness. All of the things that were missed and the decisions that were made created nothing but the perfect storm for the Titanic to sink. In the end, as with every ship, the sole blame lies, unfortunately, with the captain, who is, above all and everyone else, charged with the safety of all souls aboard his ship. He's not alone to blame, as like I said, there are a myriad of other factors, both internal and external to Titanic, that not only cost the ship, but all of those who never made it out, their lives. The legend of the RMS Titanic has survived in many movies, the first of which, Saved from the Titanic, was released only 29 days after it sank. There is also 1958's A Night to Remember, and the more iconic titular Titanic from 1997. Yeah, it came out in 1997. Feel old yet? Unfortunately, in light of the recent events, the Ship of Dreams, or Ship of Sorrows, was drug up from the black depths of the Atlantic and into the public eye once again. The RMS Titanic will forever be a part of our history, even when the smallest organisms alive have broken it down, and it exists as nothing more than a pile of scrap on the ocean floor, or is someday washed away altogether. Titanic forever remains a gravesite, and, as humanity, we owe nothing more than to pay our respects to the legacy of the survivors, the bodies that were plucked from the North Atlantic and are now buried, and those passengers and crew who forevermore will lay asleep beneath the waves. With this message, we conclude the second of two parts of our Chapter 43 covering the sinking and the legacy of the RMS Titanic. I really hope you enjoyed listening to not only the history of the event, but the stories of the crew and passengers, as well as the comparisons and clarifications to James Cameron's film. Above all, I hope you took at least one thing away that you didn't know before. As with most episodes, there are many details still out there that I've left untold, and I highly encourage you to read further and search up survivors' stories. As a reminder, please come back next week, where you'll hear the story of third-class survivor Leah Axe from her great-granddaughter, Dr. Shelley Binder. Before you go, remember to subscribe so you can find your way back next week for another exciting story. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda podcast release every Tuesday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. As always, I've been your host, Nick, and I want to thank you very much for listening.